Between 1994 and 2002, Dr. Adams worked with former IRA prisoners in support of Northern Ireland peace process. He's also a former anti-apartheid activist and a member of the African National Congress. He's the author of 4 books and numerous academic articles with a focus on international conflicts, specifically in South Africa and Northern Ireland. And he's also written several articles for New York Times, Chicago Tribune, the Australian Huffington Post, International Herald Tribune, and he's also appeared in a number of, he's been an expert commentator on Al Jazeera, BBC, ARD, and so on. So without any further delay, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Adams. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, and thank you, Federica, for organizing this. I really appreciate it. And as I was saying, I was in Harvard only once ever before. Actually, I've been here twice. Once for a friend's wedding, and once many years ago I did an executive leadership program for my old work across the river in that other part of Harvard, the business school. So it's nice to be here again, and it's particularly nice to be here in the Kennedy School. So thank you very much for having me, and I really appreciate it. And then thank you all for coming out on what is obviously a very kind of cold and rainy and miserable day. The winter has definitely arrived. As I was saying, as a Southern Hemisphere person, I'm never really ready for the arrival of winter. So to see anybody go anywhere on a day like this is impressive to me. I thought I might just say a few things about R2P, and then what maybe do is just throw it open, and we can just kind of argue the toss a little bit around it. If people have comments or questions or want to follow up on anything, we can do that. But maybe I'll just kind of start by way of an introduction, maybe with saying a few things about Rwanda, because I think it's impossible to understand R2P without understanding Rwanda. And 20 years ago, on the 6th of April, 1994, the genocide in Rwanda started, and as you all know, I'm sure, over the following 100 days, at least 800,000 people were killed in what was probably the fastest genocide of the 20th century. And I think, you know, what never ceases to amaze me about Rwanda, and I've had the opportunity to travel there many times, but one thing that always kind of disturbs me and is remarkable to me is that this was a genocide carried out largely with farm implements. And you actually think of and I use the term advisedly, the hard work that goes into killing 800,000 people over 100 days. And when I went there for the first time after the genocide, the numbers were staggering to me, but also the effort. You know, you would visit sites where 10,000 or 12,000 people were killed, and where it took 2 or 3 days of vigorous labor on behalf of the genocidaires to actually exterminate the people in question. But I don't want to depress everybody with that opening, but you know, there was a famous event that happens at the start of the genocide that you may be aware of, where a number of people, I think about 3,500, had been sheltering in the technical college on the outskirts of Kigali, and after the murder of 10 Belgian peacekeepers elsewhere in Kigali, the Belgian paratroopers who had been guarding those 3,500 people from several hundred Interahamwe, or genocidaires if you like, who had encircled the school and were besieging the school. The paratroopers essentially packed up and left at about 11 o'clock in the morning on, I think, the 11th of April. And it's one of those kind of signal events in the genocide that marks out you know, a tremendously sad story, and one which really in many ways encapsulates the utter abandonment of those people by the United Nations. And through no fault of my own, I guess I just happened to be in Rwanda when the mass grave of all those who were subsequently killed at that school was opened, and they were being reburied. I should say the people at that school were sent on a death march so the Interahamwe killed some of them, and then they marched the rest to a garbage dump, which they thought was an appropriate site for dispensing with them, and they were pretty much all killed. And as I said, in the aftermath of the genocide, there was a mass grave that was put together in order to dispose of the corpses and to commemorate or to acknowledge what had happened there, but it was an imperfect arrangement, and some years later they opened it again in order to move those bodies to a more appropriate resting place. And I just happened to be there at the time, and it's certainly an event which will never leave me, and which had a kind of in a very profound way, made me think about the issues of sovereignty, issues of international responsibility, issues of when and how should the international community come to the assistance of people in need. Trust me, when you're standing on the edge of a mass grave watching 3,500 skeletons come out of it, it can certainly focus your mind on these questions. And this year, actually, on the actual 20th anniversary of those events, I happened to be at the school, the ETO in Kigali, and I was doing an interview with our visitor, actually, who you mentioned before. And within eyesight of me was the gates, those very same gates that the paratroopers had driven out, abandoning those people to their fate exactly 20 years earlier. And it struck me that site was a very good location to run through my own mind, and I think everybody's minds, how far we have come since 1994 and how far we still have to go since 1994 in order to address these issues of mass atrocity prevention. Because in some really basic and obvious way, every single one of those bone skulls, again, I don't want to get too graphic, but every one of them was a kind of indictment to me of the international community and of the abject and total failure of the international community in 1994. And I say that also because, as I've intimated, I believe that Rwanda haunts every discussion of the responsibility to protect or of mass atrocity prevention in the world today. And if we can maybe go back to some of that to talk about the origins of this concept. Rwanda is the launching point for a kind of process of soul searching inside the United Nations, most specifically, but I think more generally amongst a number of world leaders, about how we confront these most conscience-shocking crimes. And it was at the start of the new millennium, 6 years later, that Kofi Annan, I think, posed it very sharply when he said, and I quote, if humanitarian intervention is an unacceptable assault on sovereignty, then how should we deal with Rwanda? How should we deal with a Srebrenica? The genocide, of course, which occurred in Bosnia the following year, in July of 1995. How should we respond to gross and systematic violations of human rights that offend every precept of our common humanity? And around the same time, he again, I think, put it very sharply, or even more sharply, when he said, state frontiers should no longer be seen as a watertight protection for war criminals and mass murderers. So Annan was, by the end of the 1990s, and he wasn't alone in this, but I think he deserves a lot of credit for this, and trying to rethink through these issues of sovereignty and of responsibility, of universal rights and of domestic responsibilities. And he was doing so not by accident. He was doing so, and I think he would be one of the first to admit as much, because he felt a tremendous personal responsibility for what had transpired in Rwanda. Now, keeping in mind he was head of the Department of Peacekeeping Operations in the UN at the time, and for what had happened at Srebrenica the following year. And so it was prompted by that kind of discussion and that prodding by Annan that the Canadian government funded the original ISIS Commission, the International Commission on Intervention in State Sovereignty. And it was through that process that the idea of the responsibility to protect was developed. And I think if you look at the key personalities of that commission, Mohammed Sanaun and Gareth Evans, and I think to Gareth goes an enormous amount of credit former Australian Foreign Minister, and the man who had sort of actually coined the phrase. And he has said, I think, many times that his predominant thinking in all of this was to shift the focus of the discussion. The discussion had been so much about the right of somebody to intervene somewhere else. And he said, it's not about anybody's right. We've got to focus it at the other end of the spectrum. We've got to make it victim-centered. What about the responsibility we have to the victims? What about their rights? Let's not talk about rights of intervention. Let's talk about the responsibility to protect. And I think in that sense, it was a very smart and a very deliberate and powerful shifting of the terms of that debate. R2P is, I think, sometimes we get bogged down in these big discussions, and there seems to be all this focus on legal concepts and its relation to international law or international humanitarian law, etc., etc. But I think at its core, R2P is a very simple concept, and it's operationally, I think it's very straightforward. The responsibility to protect is focused on 4 crimes which are elaborated in the Rome Statute of the ICC. Those crimes being the crime of genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing. And it is based on 3 operational pillars, if you like. The first pillar being the responsibility of every state in the world to protect its populations from these 4 mass atrocity crimes. The second pillar being the broader responsibility of the international community to assist a state that is struggling to uphold its responsibility, to not turn its back, to not walk away, but to help where it can and how it can. And thirdly and finally, only when a state is manifestly unwilling or manifestly unable to uphold its responsibility, then and only then, Pillar 3 talks about coercive measures. And I think people's minds, when they hear coercive measures, immediately leap to cruise missiles and F-18s. But I would say that there's a whole range of coercive measures before that, whether it be sanctions, whether it be commissions of inquiry, whether it be ICC referral or other types of legal referral that can take play in there. I think the other thing that I always try to emphasize in this discussion is that I think the origins of R2P also lie in Africa, and I think that's something that is not widely acknowledged, that it's impossible to conceive of R2P in separation from, as I said, the genocide in Rwanda, but also at the intellectual level. It was actually African scholars like Francis Deng, the former Special Advisor for Prevention of Genocide and now the permanent representative for the state of South Sudan, who developed the ideas around sovereignty as responsibility, saying that sovereignty isn't a license to kill. Sovereignty entails responsibility. And also, of course, we see before the formulation R2P and its adoption at the 2005 World Summit, we see the African Union embedding these kinds of ideas via Article 4H of the African Union's Constitutive Act, which I think was 2002, or 2000 actually, when it was first formulated and then endorsed in 2002. And this has had a huge impact, I think, again on pushing the debate forward and in formulating some of the ideas. Because I think in sovereignty as responsibility and in the concept of the sovereignty, the responsibility to protect, I think it did 2 things. It was a fundamental rejection, to use the words of my friend Ramesh Thakur. It was a fundamental rejection of both unilateral interference and institutional indifference. So it said we can't just ignore what happens in the world, but having made a decision to not ignore it, we can't just decide for ourselves that we're going to go throw our weight around here, or we're going to go intervene there, or we're going to tell you what you should be doing there. So it was trying to reconcile those 2 things. So where are we at? It's been 10 years since 2005, coming up next year, World Summit Outcome document. And I think, R2P has made a real impact in a number of situations. including in a lot of situations where it's been very much about prevention and about pulling states back from a more catastrophic path to conflict and mass atrocities. And it's also played, I think it's fair to say, a fairly decisive role in some situations where unfortunately coercive measures up to and including military force have been deployed. And in that category I would obviously include Libya in 2011 and Cote d'Ivoire in 2011 as well. And it hasn't been without disappointments, it hasn't been without failures and setbacks. I mean, to state the absolute obvious, I mean, Syria has been a historic catastrophe and an utter failure. Although there have been very divisive debates with regard to R2P around, for example, its application to Sri Lanka and the end of the civil war in Sri Lanka, and to other situations as well. And I think these cases that I've just mentioned are difficult, but they're difficult because they raise issues of accountability and issues around coercion to halt mass atrocities. And these are issues that the UN Security Council has always struggled to address with undeviating and proximate determination across its entire history, not just over the last couple of years. And I think at the core of R2P is prevention. I think it's there in everything that R2P is about. It's there in terms of preventing an initial outbreak of a crisis, preventing its escalation, preventing its recurrence. And I think there's a false dichotomy that's been created in some people's minds that prevention is the easy stuff and kind of response is the difficult bit. It's not true, actually. And in my work with the Global Center, I often find the reverse. The issues of prevention are, in fact, very difficult to work on. Early warning, how you work with states in saying we're very concerned about the situation in your country, and here's what we think should be done about it, or else you're heading down a dangerous path. Or at the accountability phase. Accountability is both response and is also prevention. I mean, history shows us one of the best ways of preventing future atrocities is dealing with holding people accountable for past atrocities. And if you look at issues of accountability with regards to, say, Sri Lanka, or with regards to Burma, Myanmar, these are hugely controversial ideas. Just try raising these issues at the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and you'll start to get an idea of, you don't have to scratch very low, far below the surface to see how emotive these issues still are. But, we've done a lot of work, and I think states have done a lot of work on the whole prevention side of things. So, for example, we act as the secretariat for something called the Global Network of R2P Focal Points, which was a government initiative. An R2P focal point is a senior government official appointed to take domestic responsibility for strengthening human rights mechanisms and mass atrocity prevention domestically, but also working globally within the network to strengthen and to share lessons and so forth. And as I said, that's an initiative which was led by Ghana and Australia, Costa Rica, and Denmark. Did I say them already? No, I don't think so. Hi.
Center for R2P, yes, please. No, it is not. It is another global.
It's another global.
There's always something on at Harvard, and there's always global involved somehow. That's the lesson here today. So we work with those states in that network, which now has, I think, 44 states who have appointed a focal point and who have become members of the network. And it's, big states, little states, powerful states, global north, global south, all continents of the world. At one end we've got, say, the United States of America. At the other end of the world, we've got Costa Rica, or states that are emerging from conflict themselves. So, I'm very proud that states like Cote d'Ivoire, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, These are states that are also members of the network, states that are struggling with their own, and recognize that they're struggling with their own internal situations, and are trying to actively deal with them and to seek help from partners. So, to shift focus a little bit. So what about when prevention fails? You know, it would be a great world if we could all just work on prevention and not ever have to worry about the other side of the equation. But I think to address, if you like, the elephant in the room, even when we look at, say, the toughest cases, and Syria has been, you know, by far the toughest over the last couple of years, where action has been blocked by the vetoes of Russia and China. Even if we look at that case, we see that individual states and regional organizations took action to uphold their responsibility to protect over the last 4 years since that conflict's been underway. And I think there's an obvious point of comparison which I always try to make, which is that 30 years ago, in 1982, when the current President Assad's father was actually the incumbent dictator in Syria, he killed about, we don't actually know how many people he killed, but he killed somewhere between 20 and 40,000 people over about a 2-week period in the town of Hama in order to suppress a small uprising that had taken place there. What was the response of the international community to that mass slaughter? Nothing. There was not even an angry press release issued by the UN or by anybody. This was, to the extent that people knew about this and they didn't know about it, this was seen as essentially a domestic issue for the government of Syria. It was unsavory, it was ugly, it was not something that people thought was good, but it was essentially seen as an issue of under domestic jurisdiction of the Syrian Arab Republic. Compare that to, say, the current context. Okay, we know how dramatically the Security Council has failed to uphold its responsibilities for the maintenance of international peace and security. But if we look at even just the first year after the conflict began in Syria, we see at least 49 countries and the Arab League had already diplomatically isolated the Syrian regime and imposed targeted sanctions upon the Syrian government. Other parts of the UN system lived up to their responsibilities. So, for example, the Human Rights Council has passed no less than 12 resolutions on Syria, set up a commission of inquiry, which is, to the extent that we have very good evidence around what's happened in the country with an eye to future prosecutions, it is very much because of the work of that commission of inquiry of the Human Rights Council. Similarly, the General Assembly has passed at least 7 resolutions condemning atrocities in Syria. As we know, of course, it's not enough. I'm not for a second pretending that this is an adequate response. But it's not like there hasn't been an attempt to deal with it, or that the world has simply said, do you know what, it's none of our business, it's on the other side of the world, it's very far away, let's just leave it, things where they lie. And so, as you know, because of the failure of the Security Council, the civil war grinds on. Now more than 200,000 dead, and we're coming up on the 4th anniversary, of course. And both sides, or all sides if you like, it's a multi-sided conflict now, continue to almost draw inspiration from one another in terms of their willingness to perpetrate even greater and more imaginative atrocities upon the Syrian people. And we'll never know. You know, I generally try to avoid counterfactuals, but we'll never know what might have happened if the Security Council had sent a clear message to the Assad government in 2011 that the way things were heading, the massacres that had already taken place, that this was unacceptable and that there would be consequences if the regime continued down that path. What we do know, and we know this for a fact, and certainly the Global Center would track this, and we've watched it very, very closely. What we do know is that the absence of timely and decisive action on behalf of the Security Council directly contributed to the sectarian civil war that we now see, endangering the lives of millions of civilians across the entire Middle East. To just extrapolate on that tiny bit. What we actually saw is that every time there was a veto in the UN Security Council, not only did violence spike in Syria in the aftermath of the veto, it actually was transformed. So for example, first time the Syrian government ever used helicopters against the Syrian people after a veto in the UN Security Council. First time it ever used fixed-wing aircraft to bomb civilian populated areas after the third veto in the UN Security Council. So the votes in the Security Council had an impact on the conflict by their sheer, essentially giving a green light to the Assad government in terms of the violence that it was deploying against its own people. So this is just one of the reasons why my organization and some other civil society organizations have been working very closely with the French government and with the Accountability, Coherence and Transparency group of states inside the UN on the whole issue of veto restraint and veto reform when it comes to mass atrocity situations. And I can talk about that more maybe in the Q&A if people are interested, but I think this is the first time really since 1945 that the veto issue has been discussed so widely, so openly and so pointedly inside in the UN. So that has been, in some very sad and tragic way, a positive outcome of the Syrian experience, is that it has brought this issue right back to the center of debates about the future of the UN as an organization. And I think it's also worth remembering that despite Syria, we have seen the Council as the preeminent body of international law and international peace and security be able to use R2P and to agree around R2P issues in a whole range of other situations. So, you know, it's something that I often get asked by journalists about the impact that Libya had on Syria, and there's a kind of a disconnect in the journalistic mind. I say that I'm laughing because I've done a lot of work in the media myself, and so I like to poke my journalistic friends. So here's the disconnect. Before Libya, there had only ever been 4 resolutions ever in the UN Security Council that referenced R2P. 2 were thematic resolutions. One was on Sudan, and one was on the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Take out the 2 Libyan resolutions, 1970 and 1973, which were passed in February and March of 2011. Since then, there have been more than 20 UN Security Council resolutions that have referenced R2P. So 4 between 2005 and 2011, 20 between 2011 and now. And these are not just light and fluffy resolutions. These are resolutions, for example, which have dealt with the situation in South Sudan, which have dealt with the situation in the Central African Republic, which have sent peacekeeping mission to the Central African Republic, Yemen, Libya again, dealing with the aftermath of Libya, have also dealt with the issue of small arms and light weapons and the arms trade, the prevention of genocide, the prevention of conflict. So there are major issues that we're talking about and very specific crises that it has tried to respond to. Also the Democratic Republic of the Congo as well. So my point being, I guess, that R2P is not just some cute acronym to be thrown around in newspaper editorials or by academics in very clever papers. R2P is actually making a real difference in real people's lives out where it counts in the field. And in that sense, I would also draw your attention to the fact that 8 out of the 16 current UN peacekeeping operations actually have an R2P / protection of civilians mandate. So 90% of the peacekeepers, UN peacekeepers in the world at the moment, are involved in protection of civilians operations, which have come through this kind of process. Yes. So, where are we at? I started by saying something around Rwanda. So, something that is always in. Hey. Sorry? Yes, of course. Come one, come all. I do a kind of a mental test because for me, this is all about the importance of the real world. You know, pretty ideas and pretty words are just that, pretty ideas and pretty words. And you know, I didn't mean to start off on such a dour note when, you know, referring back to the genocide. But honestly, not a week goes past where I don't think of that grave. And you know, my staff gets sick of me telling this story, but none of you work for me, so I'll tell it again. I mean, you know, I was standing there that day, and one of the skeletons that came out was of a young woman, and I don't know how, but the dress that she had been wearing on the day she was killed was like perfectly preserved, and she was wearing this bright summer's dress, clearly a young woman in the prime of her life. And you know, there's not a week that goes past where I don't think about her and think about the thought process that must have gone through her head when the gates opened that day and the Interahamwe came in. And I don't think the thoughts, and I can't project completely into her mind, but I don't think her thoughts were about sovereignty and international law. I think the thoughts were probably, why has this been the fate that I've been abandoned to? Where is the world? Why is this what is to happen to me? So for me, it always comes back to not just the individual, but the person, you know, trying to provide a voice for the voiceless, trying to think of how we actually increase protection for the most vulnerable in the world in which we live. And I've been fortunate or unfortunate, depending on how you want to view it, enough to work in a number of conflict zones and to work in a number of situations where, you know, mass atrocities have occurred. And for me, that is the test, is how does it actually affect real people's lives? And so by way of kind of ending at least the comments I wanted to make, you know, there's just two very quick case studies I'd like to say something about, because I think they show where we've made progress and yet where we've still got so much more progress to make. And it's South Sudan and the Central African Republic. And the reason why I grouped them together is because the conflict in the Central African Republic really took a turn for the catastrophic worst on the 5th of December 2013. And the civil war in South Sudan started on the 15th of December 2013, 10 days apart. So it's a kind of an interesting test in some way, because they were happening at the same time. You know, and I think that what we see is that the response was very different in both cases. In the case of South Sudan, a country that a number of international powers around the world had invested in emotionally, and invested in physically, and invested in terms of dollars and cents. There was a move to push the UN Security Council very quickly into shifting into a protection of civilians mode, increasing the number of troops and the number of police on the ground, so the ceiling was increased almost. I think the war started on the 15th. I think the resolution was passed on the 18th, which basically said the UN needs to protect civilians in the context of this civil war. It should open the gates of all UN bases and allow people to come in, and it should physically protect them. And we need to urgently increase the number of police and the number of UN peacekeepers who were there on the ground. So it was a positive response. Then I kind of compare it in my own mind to the response in the Central African Republic. Ourselves and some other organizations had been warning for quite a while, at least since April of 2013, that things were really going off the rails in the Central African Republic. And the constant refrain from some UN Security Council members was that this is a law and order issue, that this is an issue to do with coup d'etat and collapse of government, and that what we need is a kind of a reconstituted gendarmerie, and things will settle down. And ourselves, and I think it weren't many people, but ourselves and a few others were saying there is a gathering storm in the Central African Republic, and you can see it on the horizon. And it is not about law and order. It is going to be catastrophic. And it is about religious violence, and it is about an absolute fracturing of this society. And this wasn't premonition, this was based on what we saw specifically as evidence that was accumulating of where the country was heading. And it, quite frankly, and this is, I guess, the nuts and bolts of advocacy, it was a tough job trying to make that argument in 2013 with the UN Security Council. It was very tough. And there was huge pushback. And part of it also was, in defense of them, was an information deficit. So people would say, well, so what's happening? And we'd say, well, nobody knows. Well, we get this report from this place. And I remember a staff member of mine literally being on the phone with a priest who was at a church in a village where like 1,000 people were sheltering or something, and talking to him, and just, that was like literally the best intelligence from that district at that time was coming through one cell phone call that was taking place between New York and the CAR. So we sent a small team to the CAR, partly to just get a better sense of what was going on. We did off-the-record briefings with the Security Council when they got back. And I think gradually the work of ourselves, the work of colleagues at Human Rights Watch and other organizations helped shift the frame inside the Security Council. And they started talking about a responsibility to protect. And they started talking about mass atrocities that were either a threat of occurring or were actually occurring in the Central African Republic. And so I would really mark Central African Republic down as a success. And I say that as well in the following way, which is that it's a joke I've been making for a while now, but I swear it's true, which is that when we started talking to some states about Central African Republic and some ambassadors, I honest to God don't think they could have found the country on a map, except that the name of the country helped give them some idea of where to start looking. It was literally, there was zero kind of registering. So if I say to you there's atrocities occurring in Sudan, it raised a series of emotional connections or of ideas. If I said there's atrocities in the Central African Republic, there was nothing. It didn't register with anything. There's no knowledge of the history, the culture, the location, the people, anything. And there was no strong vested interest. And so therefore, people think vested interest, and vested interest clearly can be a bad thing when it comes to international politics. It can also be a good thing if people feel a connection to the country or the people and feel, therefore, somewhat of an obligation to do something about it. So getting that mission, that peacekeeping, UN peacekeeping mission approved for the Central African Republic, I think was a very important victory for those of us in the world of R2P and mass atrocity prevention. And yet it contained within it, of course, a horrible and tragic failure. 80% of the Muslim population of the CAR has either been killed or displaced. Fact. So it comes too late for way too many people. And the other thing is, despite the approval of that mission, and this is where we really start to get into the nuts and bolts, the force on the ground is only at 2/3 of its strength. We literally can't get enough states to give troops and police to actually go to the Central African Republic and to put their people there to help protect civilians. But this raises much bigger issues than just Central African Republic or the responsibility to protect. It raises huge issues about the future of UN peacekeeping and the nature of UN peacekeeping in the early 21st century. So that for me is the kind of the test, and I think you can tell from what I'm saying that I think the answer to the test is mixed. I think there's some real positives, some real progress, unquestionably progress, but some real weaknesses and dark spots and problems as well. But to circle all the way back, if you like, to where I start, and I've certainly thought about this a lot in terms of the Central African Republic, which was, if you are old enough, and I regret that I think that only maybe a couple of us in the room might be old enough to actually have a memory of the Rwandan genocide in 1994. But the arguments then were, where is this place? I've never heard of it. you know, what's there? What is Rwanda? This indifference that flowed from ignorance was certainly a huge part of the international community's discussion around what it should or should not do in Rwanda. And also, to again pick up on the point that I departed on, here's another really interesting thing. Now, for me, this should be on the front page of the New York Times, or at least the Harvard, what's the Harvard newspaper? The Crimson. You know, at the start of the genocide in Rwanda, I mentioned that 10 Belgian peacekeepers were killed. That was no accident. The genocidaires killed them because they thought that what happens when you kill white UN peacekeepers is that they run away, and then we can get to the job of actually exterminating these people, exterminating the Tutsi. So, in the Central African Republic, since last year, 26 African Union peacekeepers have been killed, 3 French soldiers have been killed, and we just lost the first 2 UN peacekeepers since the mission hit the ground on the 15th of September. That is a massive loss and a tragic loss of human lives, of people who have gone far to try and protect people who they have no connection with, other than the fact that they think that they shouldn't have to face machetes and this kind of violence alone. And I think the fact that people have stuck with the mission, the fact that people have stayed and not pulled out their troops, does represent in some other way a real progress since 1994. I think we've done better to overcome, if you like, the politics of indifference. So let me end by, I guess, saying this, which is, you know, I still very strongly and firmly believe that R2P is the kind of political and practical nexus where sovereignty and responsibility collide or intersect, depending on how you want to view it. And in this anniversary year of the Rwandan genocide, you know, I think we're reminded that wherever and whenever people are targeted for their religion or for their lack of religion, for their ethnicity or their race, for their sexual orientation or for their political allegiances, then, you know, we hear not only the deadly echo of the past, but also, I think, a disturbing portent of the future. And on that note,